Okay, so yeah, all these workarounds in place, but let's start. Let's start on today, and qualitative methods. Let me get to that. So far we've been looking at numbers, we've been looking at quantitative research data, and most of the stuff we do in psychology is quantitative. Anything that we can turn into numbers and analyse using statistics, and sort of post-Freudian days, everything that psychology took a huge twist into quantitative methodologies with behaviourism and all that sort of stuff, and the rise of cognitive psychology, and so everything became quantitative. And then computers came along, and computers just added to the morass, really, simply because it enabled us to do much more complicated statistical techniques at the click of a mouse, and so that just made things grow in that way. And most of the research that's done in psychology now is still quantitative. I'm guessing at more than 80%. It could even be more than 90%. I haven't found an exact figure from anywhere, but it's still nearly all quantitative, although qualitative is certainly on the rise. I'll just break off. Milka, will you have access to the materials necessary for completing the qualitative assignment? Absolutely you will, just by different means. So through live seminars and through the stuff that's in Dropbox, all the stuff will be there. So you'll definitely be able to do it. Okay. So it's a huge paradigm shift, really, from quant to qual, because qualitative research is interested in stuff, is interested in interpretation of things that you can't analyse sensibly using statistical techniques. And the vast majority of that is based around language. Language is one of those things that, you can do things like count numbers of words and things like that, but that doesn't give you anything about the meaning of what we say. And the meaning of what we say is obviously massively important. It underpins everything in many ways in terms of what we are. Indeed, I read a very interesting paper a few years ago. I'm going off topic a little bit here, but a very interesting paper a few years ago that was making the argument that language wasn't a consequence of our advanced cognitive capacity, but actually our advanced cognitive capacity was a consequence of the development of language, and that language was the sort of underpinning element of it all, which is, I think, a very interesting perspective to take. Can't remember what I did with that. Probably got it on my U drive somewhere, but I'll never find that again. But language is sort of massively important to us as humans, and so it's not surprising, really, that people have made this new focus in terms of, or increased the focus on looking at qualitative research in terms of the things that people say and how they say it and what they mean when they say it. One of the things that was problematic about qualitative research when it first started to grow was that because there was no sort of objective benchmarks like there are in quantitative methods, like effect sizes and p-values, and numbers are just sort of a bit more, easy to work with, I suppose, in many respects, so that they are reproducible. One of the problems with qualitative stuff was people criticised it for having a lack of rigour, because it's subjective. There is a certain subjective element to it, and that can't be denied. And this was So hang on, Hannah. So you've put quant assignment in there twice. So could we extend the deadline of the quant assignment to the 27th so we can do... Oh, so you can do the qual assignment first. So you mean both have the same deadline? Well, it wouldn't trouble me for that to be the case. I mean, and of course, a deadline is a deadline, and if you've got it done, you can submit it earlier, anyway. So I don't want to, if I push back a deadline, I would like to think that it's only for those who need it, and not that it means that you don't have to do, that if you've got it done, you've got it done. But I could do that. Yeah, so where was I? So, lack of rigour in qualitative methodology because you haven't got these benchmarks to work with. But this is something that is much less problematic now as qualitative methods have developed and people accept that there is a level of rigour in qualitative methodology and that it adds something to the mix in a considerable way. And indeed, a lot of large research teams now will have qualitative and quantitative researchers working on the same thing to look at things because they can see the complementarity of, is that a word? Complementary nature of these two elements to really get a thorough understanding of what's going on. Have I got anything on confidence intervals in Dropbox? If I haven't, then I'll put something there. Okay. So why is my mouse working on that screen? Oh, there we go. Looks like I've overlaid this twice. Comparing qualitative and quantitative research, just a table that I nabbed from somewhere that just basically tries to cover the distinct elements between them. And the sort of overarching thing really is that quantitative research is aimed at being much, much more precise in terms of the design of studies, random allocation of participants, using very precise measures where we know exactly the sort of data that we're going to get, and importantly that what we do is we test hypotheses, whereas in qualitative research it's much more investigative in many respects, and the researcher gets himself involved in the actual research, and that leads to the larger subjective nature of it all. And another major difference is the sample sizes that people use. People like to use larger samples for quant research because it increases the power and the generalizability of the findings, whereas in qualitative studies, because of the in-depth nature of it, the samples tend to be very small. So this is an interesting slide in itself because different types of qualitative research. Now, when we've been talking about stats, I've been annoyed and you've been annoyed about the different terminology that people use and the fact that statisticians can't seem to agree with one another about what different things should be. Well, interestingly, qualitative researchers are kind of the same as well. So I've put down 6 types of qualitative research here. But depending on where you look, you might read about 4 different types of qualitative research, 5 different types of qualitative research, or even more than 6 types of qualitative research. And it seems that just like statisticians, qual researchers can't always come to a consensus of what the final number is. But I've put down 6 here, which I think cover different areas of qualitative research. And what I'm going to do is I will go through these different types in various different levels of detail in terms of what they are and in terms of a particular paper in most cases just outlining what somebody did and how it fits into the different area that was done. And I will finish off with the last one, phenomenological, because that's what applies to the qualitative assignment you've got to do. So I'll spend more time on that than on the others. Okay, so starting with the first one on that list there, ethnographics. The ethnographic model. Not massively used in psychology, much more used in things like anthropology and sociology. But basically, the whole point of it is that you immerse yourself as a researcher. I've put subject there, that's probably not the best word to use. As a researcher, you immerse yourself in a culture that is unfamiliar to you, so that you can learn about the way the culture is organised and the way that it works, so you can get an understanding of what's going on. And it tends to be time-consuming and expensive. Sort of things that people do is that they might join a football hooligan gang or something like that, so that they can really understand what's going on in the conversations that the hooligans have, their attitudes, their goals, the meaning of being a football hooligan, and that sort of thing. And an example of this is a paper by Duncan. It's this paper by Duncan where he was looking at the schooling of adolescent black males in the US, and he was trying to understand this, and it's not exactly a culture that's unfamiliar to them, in that it was in an educational setting and this person was very well versed in education, but of course he wasn't familiar with what it was like to be a black adolescent male in school. It's quite an interesting piece of research for a number of different reasons. First of all, it took him 2 years to do. So it was 2 years in a US school. I've forgotten the name of the school now. CHA is its CHS is its shorthand. But anyway, he was in this US school. Not on his own. He had a team of research assistants with him. And over 2 years, conducted interviews, focus groups, and observations in classrooms, and observations in common rooms, and observations in recreation areas, and all of this sort of stuff. He talked to students, he talked to staff, he talked to the administrators. He even did some teaching there. He taught some classes there to sort of get an experience from the hands-on teacher's perspective as well. One of the things that really drew him to this particular area or this particular school was this was a high-performing school, but it was flagged as a success story for the desegregation of schooling in America. And interestingly enough, although it was flagged for that, the period of time that he was there, only 10% of the student population were in fact black students, when the school was in an 80% black population area. So although it was flagged as a success for desegregation, the black students were not attending this school, and this was something else that he was interested in. Anyway, he spent an awful lot of time there, and the one thing, the sort of overarching thing that he came out of this with his research was that the school still constructed the adolescent black males as a strange or a different population that had values and attitudes that were different from the other white students. The way that they saw them was that the school identified the black adolescent pupils being marginalised as a consequence of their own attitudes and activities, which is a very negative spin for the school to put on it. It's supposed to be a desegregated, welcoming, supporting ethos to support black adolescents to do well, and yet you might, if it was, for want of a better phrase, it was institutionally racist in the way that it viewed the black adolescent pupils. So that's an example of ethnographic research. Anyway, you go in somewhere and you spend ages and ages living the experience of people there and trying to get as much understanding as you possibly can. The next one is grounded theory. Now, grounded theory is one of the most well-developed in many respects areas of qualitative research, because it's about theory generation, which in many respects is useful for other areas of psychology, because once you've produced a theory in a qualitative manner, you can actually then develop it for testing, perhaps, in a quantitative manner. And so this provides a nice grounding for the coming together of the two different approaches. Basically, it's generally used for something that has no existing theory that explains what's going on in a particular phenomena. And so grounded theory can be used to try and develop some kind of an overarching understanding theoretical perspective. One of the big things about qualitative stuff compared to quantitative stuff is the fact that qualitative stuff is inductive. So it's about developing theories as opposed to the deductive aim of quantitative research, which is about testing them or testing hypotheses. It's, as I say, well established. It's a bit woolly. You could say this about most qualitative methods, I suppose. But I suppose because it's well established, grounded theory tends to be a bit woolly, and you can read lots of different papers by different researchers describing their approach as grounded theory when they do very different things, which doesn't help particularly. But the overall perspective is that what you do is you gather data and you analyse data to try and get a theoretical perspective on something. So the example that I've got here, Fletcher and Sarker, is quite a good one in terms of the way that this sort of stuff works. So they were looking at the idea of resilience in high-performance sports athletes, or Olympic athletes, anyway. This is something that is nowadays, I mean, this was back 2012, which isn't all that long ago, but resilience in athletes is something that is much, much more widely recognised and seen as important now. So, Mark, in Qual, there is no reject-acceptor hypothesis at all. They don't have hypotheses in qualitative research. They're searching out information that may then lead to quantitative researchers having hypotheses to test. So, Fletcher and Sarker argued that the relationship between psych resilience and sport performance hadn't been systematically examined. It very much has been, or is much, much more now. And so they went out and they were, I don't know how they managed to access Olympic gold medalists, but they did. Not an easy thing to do. Now, interestingly, when I was reading this paper and I read about the sample were aged 33 to 70, so they weren't actually current athletes. And I felt that this was potentially something of a confound to the research, in that this would be a very retrospective view, especially for someone who's a 70-year-old, asking them about their psych resilience at the time when they were a sports performer. I thought that it would be much better done if they were current athletes. Anyway, they still did well to get gold medalists. 12 typical sample in Qual? I've seen, there was a study that I'll go on to in a minute that's got 2 participants in it. 12's quite a lot, perhaps not for grounded theory, but for other areas it is. So, it is certainly commercial. So Hayden, you did a point about how it differs from commercial Qual research. I've seen a few things about the way that different businesses use Qual research and what they are trying to achieve out of it. And I'd have to say that generally academics would argue that the conclusions and things like that that's being drawn in commercial research are beyond those that would be considered appropriate in academic research. There is certainly a difference there. Anyway, back to these Olympic champions. There's also another thing about these champions, in that they started off with their sample, so they gathered their participants gradually, and they started off, and most of their early participants were older individual sportsmen in individual sports, and then as they got to the later athletes, they were younger, involved in team sports. And I think it's interesting that they had the mix, but they haven't got a nice sort of mix in terms of age and sports in there if they've got older individuals and younger teams, because I would have thought that the dynamics of team sport and individual sport would be quite different. And it could have been good to have a sort of closer age mix across the groups, I would have thought. I just want to check, is this QuickTime Player still recording? I have no idea if it is. Yeah, it's still recording by the look of it. That seems good. Okay. Okay, yes, so back to this story. So what did they got all these gold medalists, and they asked them about their human-computer interaction, apparently. Unless I'm very much mistaken, Hayden. Yeah, so they got people across these different groups that they said they could then use to identify similarities and differences in the emerging categories. But I don't know if that's what they actually went on to do, to look at these differences. They brought it all together in one model, which makes sense. Okay, so how did they go about doing it? So they did life story interviews. Now this is interesting that they used life story interviews, because life story interviews relates to the narrative approach, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And of course, life story interviews, when you're looking back for a 70-year-old, some probably 50 years or something, is interesting in terms of potential, as I say, accuracy, etc. Typical of qualitative methods, they used a flexible, evolutionary set of questions. This is something that is a core element of qualitative research, is that a large portion of qualitative research is done using interviews. But when you do an interview in qualitative research, you haven't got a set of questions that you ask and then you just get the answers for. You ask a question and then you change questions to some extent. They evolve in an interview based on what your participant is saying to you. So it's not a fixed set of questions, and this is very important, really, because sometimes somebody will say something in a response to a question, and you want to have more information on that, and it might take the interview down a different road between different participants, and this is important because different people have different things that they've got to say and different things that they want to follow on. But the sorts of questions that they used, and it's my underlining that I've put in here. Could you describe to me an event? Looking back, what did you think at that time? What personal characteristics do you think helped you to withstand? It's all about drawing information out of the participants. You have to be really, really careful that you don't use questions that are closed questions, in other words, that the participant can answer yes or no to, because that gives you no information whatsoever. And you also have to ask questions that are not leading. So what personal characteristics do you think helped you to withstand the demands? Not putting something into their mouth. So, yeah, you get to some comparison of what people might say when you get to the analysis stage, but at the gathering the data stage, it's getting the individual to provide their insights. That's the important thing, and not answering in a way that you might have led them down or giving them something that they can answer yes or no to. In later questions, they tried to move on a little bit to allow theoretical links to develop. So how did your thoughts affect the way you responded to the situation? Bringing the two things together. How do you think your responses affected your performance? So starting off with how you feel, how you think, and then pulling together these thoughts and feelings and responses in terms of their thing that they're actually doing, which is their sport. You get all of their answers, you get this huge interview text like you will see for an interview text for the qualitative assignment, and the analysis that they did, and they went through open coding, which is looking at the basic little segments of text to identify small categories. And then you get these small categories and you clump them together to get bigger categories, or axial coding as they've called it here. And then went through a constant comparative method, which is effectively you compare incidents that one person mentioned to incidents another person mentioned. You compare incidents to developing concepts to concepts, and relationships to relationship. And effectively, when you're doing qualitative analysis, what you should be doing is revisiting the data a number of times, so that you don't just do it once and read through an interview and think, well, that's that then, I've sorted that out. You read through it, you do put some codes in, you put some links in. People often use different coloured pens for coding so that they can sort of highlight text in different colours, so they say, oh, that seems to go with that bit there, that seems to be linked with that bit there. And you get certain bits that will be coded with 3 different colours because something somebody said falls into different categories. And then you have to pull all of these things together to get something of a framework that describes what it is that people have been talking about. And the framework that these people came up with was this one. So this is a sort of thing that you might see in grounded theory more than other qualitative methods, where people have pulled together the various different things they found, and they have this, if you like, theoretical framework of what's going on. And in this model, you've got this psychological resilience is this box that goes around everything else. It's an overarching concept that, if you like, encapsulates all the other elements. Now, why it's useful to sort of see things, grounded theory, in this sort of light is that it then actually provides the opportunity for quantitative research to then look at these various different things and see if they can come up with quantitative models that will measure them as well. Now, we do have some quite complex statistical techniques like structural equation modelling that allow a very complex model such as this to actually be tested statistically, assuming you can find things that measure all the various different things that are in there, such as positive personality, perceived social support, focus, motivation, confidence, challenge appraisal, and things like that. All of these various different things. And so grounded theory provides this qualitative theoretical model that the authors then discuss. Having presented the model, they talk about all the various different concepts that are in there and how they relate to what people have said. But it also gives a good stepping stone as well to bring qualitative into quantitative. So that's grounded theory. Next up, case studies. Now, case studies. So I can't remember who asked about 12 being a sample size in qualitative methods. Well, a case study, it might be just one test subject. Sometimes, often, you might see case control studies. So it might be one participant again who is in a particular category to compare to another individual who's their control. And although case studies in psychology are usually an individual, they can be larger units, such as families or even towns or cities, but you wouldn't normally see case studies in psychological research that's towns or cities, but you might see it in sociological research or anthropological research. But ideally, in a case study, you might gain data from a range of different sources. Not always. They can be just from interviews, but you would generally try and get data from other sources as well. So if it's a particular psychological problem, you might gather data from doctors, practitioners, counsellors, or whoever's working with the individual as well, to get different views on the same individual and their particular circumstances. They're really useful because a lot of psychological problems are very, very individual. And one of the problems that the medicalisation of psychology has had is that it takes a psychological problem, takes individuals with a problem and puts them in a box with all the other individuals who've been identified as having that problem. And yet the development and assistance of somebody with a particular problem can be a very individual thing. And so a case study is obviously very, very useful because it takes the individual and looks at them. So the example paper, and I meant to say that some of these papers I've already put on Dropbox. I'll put other ones on that you might that I talk about here, should you feel the desire to read them in full. This particular case study paper was actually on two individuals. Two individuals who had compulsive sexual behaviours and were chemically dependent, so effectively having what you might see as two different problems at the same time. Although, as the paper looks at it, the two things are part of the same problem, as it were. So there were two women involved. Neither of them had any recorded sexual abuse in their history and no memory of any sexual abuse in their history. But they did identify problems with their families, particularly, interestingly, relationships with their mothers, but no actual physical or sexual abuse. The one thing that they had in common, or one of the two things that they had in common, was that they acted out sexually. So to act out sexually is any form of sexual behaviour whose primary function is to avoid uncomfortable feelings and other facts that might exist in their lives. Basically, sexually acting out is considered to be driven by the attempt to simply keep those feelings and cognitions from awareness. So you engage in unsolicited sexual activity on a high level because it just, if you like, it takes your mind off it. Problem with this kind of behaviour is that it presents complications to standard treatment professionals. If you are, well, now that's interesting. It's kind of similar, but not quite the equivalent mark to alcoholism, in that alcohol is a highly addictive substance in its own right, whereas to some extent sex has not been accepted as an addictive behaviour in its own right. Now, they are dependent on other substances, which is related to this, but it could be that they're having sex as a coping mechanism for their chemical addiction. Had they suffered any trauma in their life? So they hadn't suffered any physical or sexual abuse, but they had bad relationships with their families, in particularly their mothers. It was what was described, as I remember it in the paper, having overbearing mothers, weak relationships like that. But there was no other trauma that had been identified, as I recall. Anyway. Both of these things, dangerous sexual behaviour, multiple partners, not using condoms, things like that, and chemical addiction. Mark, I don't think, if I remember rightly, that sex addiction, the last time I looked at the APA, wasn't in there. I think there is things like hypersexuality, but I'm pretty sure that the APA currently doesn't acknowledge sex addiction as a disorder. But of course, the thing about that is, it doesn't mean that it's not. It just means that it's not currently recognised. And we always have to, I think, take a view when we look at these things. That just because it's not currently in the list doesn't mean that it isn't something. It was only in the mid-1970s that homosexuality was taken out of the APA guidelines as being a psychological disorder, that needed treatment. So, things change. So it could be in at some point. Yeah, that's right. Male actors do use sex addiction as an excuse, and I think if you pay a high enough price for your therapy, I'm sure that they'll agree that that's what it is. But yeah, it's not in the APA at the moment anyway. Okay, so anyway, it's risky behaviour. It's bad for themselves, and it can be risky to others. Um, and both women went in and they did 3 2.5 hour interviews each when they were talking about their lives and their experiences and everything like that. And that is a long interview process. I mean, for a typical interview, usually you might do 45 minutes or something like that. So these had very, very long interview experiences. So long that I seem to have put it on 2 slides. Anyway, what I found interesting, particularly about this when I was reading through it, is that so they did the interviews, they got the transcripts, they read and reviewed the transcripts prior to assigning units. So rather than using codes, they talked about units. It's so La Palsa. It sort of is. The interview was actually drawn from an IPA study of more than one participant, but I didn't want to overburden you, so I just gave you one participant. So it's kind of like a case study, but it's using IPA as the means of analysis, and it's the analysis thing that's the important thing for the assignment. So I found this interesting because they were talking about units, categories, and then themes, as opposed to using codes and then using superordinate and subordinate themes. It just made me, again, recognise the fact that Qual researchers use different terms in the same way that Quant ones do too. Anyway, 3 main themes came out of their analysis: mother unsafe, tension and stress in the family of origin, and isolation. And the other thing that came out were themes that defined the individual cases. And again, this is important about the point about case studies, is that there's some common areas, but there's 2 very individual things. And one of them was the theme of control of sex through church activity. So one of them went to church to try and take them away from their sexual activity, and they had this sort of combating good and bad thing going on, whereas the other one was using sex as a substitute for love, and was trying to find love, but was using sex as a substitute for it. Okay, next one, and I'm going to have to speed up a bit in a minute. So the final conclusions, they said they supported literature on other things. They talked about sexual addiction there, so there you go. Early identification would obviously help people in terms of relapse and other situations. And overall, they were making a play for saying that case studies are really useful in this situation because it can be helpful with the overall outcome for themselves as individuals, but also as help for other individuals as well who may be coming into treatment. If you use case studies, then you can find a more readily useful treatment route. And this is something that is growing in recognition and importance in clinical psychology in the UK now, is the idea of using case formulation as opposed to diagnosis. And you take every case on its merits and on its individuality, rather than trying to go through a case to see if you can diagnose an individual as having something. And I think that it's a very useful way forward. The only thing is that it's bloody expensive, of course, and that never goes down well. Okay, the historical model I shall cover only very briefly. It's not something that you see an awful lot of in terms of psychology in itself. Certainly much more in terms of sociology, although behavioural scientists, psychologists get involved in this sort of thing. And basically it's using information from the past to really understand where we are, how we got to where we are, and where we might go in the future. Businesses use it to try and read the markets and see where they might actually go with new campaigns. How do you do it? Well, there's lots of qualitative material out there historically, of course. Books, there's loads and loads of books. How did people write about history? What did they actually say? Newspapers, how did they report the things that were going on? And of course nowadays we've got TV and we've got film, and now of course we've got things like YouTube, we've got things like social media. We have got so much information on the way that people actually talk about things. I mean, Donald Trump's an absolute dream for people who are interested in this sort of stuff, because with his incessant tweeting, people will be looking back at his tweets for years, in centuries to come, as to this is how a certain individual viewed the world and talked about things. It's... So, can you do your thesis? Could you do you could do some historical kind of research if you wanted to. It would be a challenge, but you could do. We've got one member of staff who's kind of interested in it a little bit from a narrative perspective. He's from Northern Ireland and does research in sort of qualitative methods around the Troubles and conflict resolution and that sort of thing. But it tends to be the sort of thing that can take an awful lot of time because of the amount of information that you've potentially got available to you. Okay, moving on quickly. Narrative model. Narrative model's becoming much more popular, treating life as a story, and it's got a lot to be said for it, because it gives people the individual to tell them about their lives so we can understand where they're from. Reduces professional centrism, focusing on... professional centrism is the fact that the professions have sort of put people into boxes and set the way that the world is up, and that's the way it is, and it sort of that takes away from the actual personal experience and the interaction of individuals' real life experiences. And the paper that I've got here is quite a good actual example of this, and it's about narrative studies about people's talking and their interaction with self-help or mutual help groups. Oh yes, Glenn, you can just do a qualitative thesis, absolutely. That's perfectly fine. You can have no quant at all. You can completely ignore quant for your thesis. More work in qual, I always think. But anyway, so this paper by Rappaport looked at mutual help organisations, so things like Alcoholics Anonymous. Alternative treatments for people with problems in living. That's what mutual help organisations are about. People go to those when they self-identify as having a problem with their lives or with living their lives. And they don't want to be diagnosed as something. They don't want to be given treatment for something. They want to identify as someone who needs help. And I quite like the quote this quote about examining Alcoholics Anonymous under the heading of treatment is like studying the flying patterns of migrating bears in winter. Alcoholics Anonymous might have the same sorts of goals as a treatment for alcoholism that is given by a medical professional, but the two things are very, very different and should be seen through a different lens. Migrating bears might move south in winter in the same way that geese fly, but you can't look at the flying patterns of the migrating bears like you can the geese. The goal might be the same, but they are very, very different things. And members of AA and similar reject the view. They don't like the view that they are receiving treatment. That's not what they are doing. They are there to help themselves and to help others, as opposed to being a recipient. They're not being given treatment. And narrative methodologies very much like to take the approach of who has the right to speak for this person. Get the person who you are talking about involved and telling you about the research. This goes on much, much more nowadays in medical research as well. Patient participation in research is a much bigger thing in medical research and health psychology research and similar things like that. It's about, don't do research on patients and then tell them about the treatment. Do research with people who are experiencing these things and work together to understand what's going on. Don't use them as participants and then say, thank you very much for your participation. I now know how I should treat you. It's about working together. And life stories and narrative models are really, really useful to be able to do this. And if you think about it, and the conclusions of Rappaport sort of sum some of this up, if you want to know about something that somebody is experiencing, then ask them to tell you about it. It's an intuitively sensible way to go about how learning or understanding somebody's perspective. And if you're talking to somebody about their life story, it's something that everybody, or almost everybody, is able to do. How are you? Who are you? How did you get to where you are? How different are you to when you were then? Or how are you the same? How different will you be in the future and why? People can talk about these things because it's talking about yourself, and everybody has a self that they can understand, or at least that they can express under the right circumstances. Another reason why it's important is that personal testimonies are effective. They are effective things. People understand, can make sense of a personal story, and they can be very, very persuasive. It's important to recognise that a narrative story, a life story, though, is not a piece of text. So if you read something, you've just got the bits of text, that's okay, but actually there's a context around what people are saying, why they are saying it. Telling a story is an active process that isn't just telling and listening. It's two things, you need them both. And it's an active process that goes back and forth from the one to the other. I always remember a line of Homer Simpson's that I always thought, where he said to Marge, "Now Marge, it takes two to lie, one to lie and one to listen." And I just, it's that kind of thing. It's the one thing is nothing on its own. Yeah, it's a very good book, Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Cat, wife for his hat. I think he mistook his wife for his hat. But they were stories of individual case studies again. It's a good book. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. So narrative's really useful. It cuts across lots of different areas, which is very, very helpful. But in the context of this particular paper, he thinks it's a very useful way to understand mutual health and self-help groups, which are very, very important activities nowadays. Okay, right, 6 minutes past 6, and I've got loads to get through that I was going to... So when people go, I fully know why, but this is more in relationship to the sort of thing that you need to do for the assignment is the phenomenological method. So it's about how an individual experiences a specific event or set of events. Generally done by interviews, can have other methods as well, but it's about how people feel about a certain event. And this is what the thing that you have to do for your assignment is. It's about a traumatic brain injury and how an individual talks about and feels about and understands their responses to that particular event. So the paper that I've exampled here, which I do think is a very good one if you want to read a paper on phenomenological method and analysis, is around chronic pain. Chronic pain, long drawn out, and is typically associated with failure of interventions to stop it, treatments. And the fact that it's long and drawn out and that there's this failure of interventions, this affects the way that people feel about the pain, the meaning of the pain to them, and also how they make sense of what's happening to them and their lives. The meaning of their lives and the meaning of the pain can change massively. And it often leads to the point where people are unable to work, so they leave work or they lose their job. They get a range of psychological problems based around worry, pessimism, powerlessness, and similar, and difficulty with supportive relationships, their own social status, often related to the fact that they've lost their job, and their own view of themselves. And it was the view of the self and the impact on the self that was the main focus of this Smith and Osborne paper. They were particularly interested in how chronic pain affects the sense of self as a consequence of the subjective experiences of an individual. They say they used IPA because they wanted to study something that is dynamic, contextual and subjective, and they thought that the ideas of identity and the self and sense-making are important in relationship to chronic pain. So they had 6 participants in this study, all working class, white, middle adulthood, male and female participants, and they'd all suffered chronic pain for between 5 and 15 years and were still suffering chronic pain. So again, they use semi-structured interviews, same sort of thing. You've got questions, sort of an outline of the sorts of questions that you're going to ask, but then you're going to just try and elucidate information from people. So they would please talk as widely as possible about the different ways pain had affected or influenced their feelings, attitudes, and beliefs about themselves. So, the analysis of the data. Lots of reading, close reading. And the way that they did this is quite interesting because they actually worked through each case one at a time. So they did all the analysis of one and then they went through the next one, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one. Often when people do this kind of research, they'll kind of do them in parallel. But they did them one at a time anyway. Bottom line is, again, you're starting from the text, you're identifying individual codes, items, call them what you will. Think, oh, there's an interesting thing where they were talking about their family, or their job, or anger, or something like that. And you code them like that and build them up into superordinate themes. And then they repeated these for each one after that. And they came up with an overarching table of all the various different themes. And what I'm just going to do is go through how they reported the results and then some of the examples of what they did so that you can understand the way that it works. So they reported their results by identifying a key theme that was overarching to all the participants and then providing quotes that supported it. Now, it was interesting actually that the key theme that they actually present, they support with text from just one of the participants in the first instance. You can see it with other quotes that come out later, but I did think it was unusual to have the overarching theme being explained through the quotes of one individual. But anyway, apart from that, I still quite like it. So here's a theme, they give the theme, they give quotes to support it, and then they give a bit of text where they interpret, and this is the interpretive bit of IPA, they interpret the meaning of what it is that the people are saying. So they add something to it. As the researcher, they're adding their own interpretation in terms of what people are saying. And then they repeat this process for subsequent themes, sometimes linking back to previous themes and previous quotes of what people said. So in this paper, there's one central theme, and that central theme is, they identified as the negative impact of pain on the self. And these quotes came from just one individual, but it's really quite telling in what they say. It's not who I am, it's just who I am, if you know what I mean. It's not really me, I get like that, and I know like you're being mean now, but I can't help it. It's the pain, it's me, but it is me doing it, but not me. Do you understand what I'm saying? If I was to describe myself like you said, I'm a nice person, but then I'm not, am I? And there's other stuff I haven't told you. If you knew, you'd be disgusted. I just get so hateful. I know you're going to say it's all me, but I can't help it, even though I don't like it. It's the mean me, my mean head, all sour and horrible. I can't cope with that bit. I cope with the pain better. So these are all chunks taken out of the first interview. The negative impact of any, clearly that you can see that there's negative impact of pain on the self there. This person's got a lot of negativity. Sarah, yes, this is where the subjective bit comes in. So they've pulled these out, they've said that these are the things that fit to that, and then they go on to say this is their interpretation. Helen introduces two selves, a nice person and the mean me, my head all sour and horrible, and seems to be in a wrestle over which is really her. And, so they're just giving their sort of interpretation of what it is that she's saying. It may be that Helen is convinced that she is still a nice person, but is worried publicly that other people perceive her to be something else. So it's putting it in their own words. And then at this last bit, alternatively and more distressing, she may see herself as engaged in a battle for her identity itself, an attempt to retain the old nice self against the onslaught of the new mean self. Now that's quite a high level interpretation of what it is that she said, but it seems reasonable based on those quotes. So there's is there essentially no right or wrong interpretation? Well, there is a wrong interpretation. If their interpretation was, well, she seems perfectly happy with herself, that would be a wholly wrong interpretation. But this interpretation is clearly reflecting what she was talking about and seems reasonable, although they're taking it to a level beyond what she was actually saying. She was saying her experiences of this good and bad self. They're saying here that she's possibly engaged in a battle for her identity itself. So they're overlaying that on what she's said. Well, conclusive, I think that it's suggestive because it's she may. It's not saying she is. It's saying that this is something that could be going on. Now, clearly, what is going on is very positive. That is for sure. How do you report observations? There are lots of different ways you can report observations. I'll not go into it. I'll Now, if you're doing an interview and somebody does something, then you would normally write it into the text. So in this piece that I'm just going through here, in the bit earlier, she actually started crying, and so that doesn't come over in the text as such. And so you wouldn't read it in the words. So in the text, they've said starts crying and things like that. So you could put things like, somebody did this or somebody did that. Well, it's interesting that you say tormented with pain, because what seems to be going on here is that the pain it's not the pain itself that's the problem, it's the effect that the pain is having on her ability to engage with others. It's not like I'm in so much pain I can't do anything. It's like I have this chronic pain that is turning me into something else. Yes, exactly, your partner. That's what she's saying. She's saying it's the chronic pain is turning her into a mean, irritable person. And the researcher is trying to explain how that is coming across and what she is saying in interpreting her words. Okay, so next one. Next theme that they've got, continuum and trajectory. Now, it's interesting because you read this one and it's kind of like the last one in some respects. It's like living with this guy who follows you around all the time, you're cursed with him and he gets in the way, he embarrasses me, he's unsociable and sometimes downright rude. If I can't be the image that I think I am, then I'm in trouble. Worse than it is now, I'm sure. When you think about it, it just feels horrible. I know when I mean it is me. I know there is no guy. I'm not mad, but it's not me. That's not me. I'm not like that. And so, again, you've got this thing that's very similar to what the previous participant was saying. But the interpretation that the researchers have put on this is Simon seems to move in and out of self-identification with the pain. He's attempted to cope with the negative effects of pain by attributing them to a different agent, this guy, who is separate yet follows Simon around. And that's a really interesting interpretation that they're taking on it. They're reading that saying, yeah, what's going on here is that you're actually dissociating yourself from it by creating this guy. It says, I know there is no guy, I'm not mad. But it's like it's partitioning himself, if you like, from that. Which again, I think is quite interesting. And then another one, and these are only bits and pieces from the paper. Another one, Frank. He seems to have almost given up this battle between good and bad me. And he says, I hate the way I am now. I've never been like this before. No, I hate it. Drives me up the wall. Yeah, being miserable all the time. I used to have a laugh. I'm a miserable git. So different participants, they're engaged in the same battle to preserve a positive sense of self, but they're different points in that battle. And so this Frank, just seems to have given up on it all. Then, this is an interesting, again, interpretation, speculatively. So the word speculatively is important that they've used. We can propose a continuum from, on the one hand, employing coping strategies to protect the self from erosion by the pain, Simon, to, on the other side, a resignation to pain having changed one's identity completely. So this is their interpretation again. This is from what their participants are saying, they're saying, well, it could be that there's a continuum of experience going on, and it goes from Simon on the one hand, where you've got this strong coping strategy of developing an altered person, if you like, to others just giving up. It is possible that one has been suffering longer than the other, and I don't know off the top of my head how it fits together here. It's not a point that they actually made in their consideration of it, though. But it's a fair point. Next theme, the public arena makes it worse. So this relates to people's self-regard and how they felt about themselves when they were around others. So Tony says, I'd love that, being alone on a desert island, but to be away from people and not have someone else, to be something else you're not, that would be bliss. I'd still be miserable, old git, but it wouldn't matter. It's only when other people come around that it matters. And so this is, the fact that they just isolate themselves to get away from the feelings of low self-regard when they are in the presence of others, which is obviously a very negative element. But it meant that those feelings of punishing themselves are reduced because they're not with other people. Similarly, about the public arena, Simon, he just locks himself away in his house. Doesn't interact with other people if he can avoid it. Just stays where he is. So it's a protective element. But it's not a good protective element. So this is the process that they go through. Is that you read through the things, you find the various different things, you put them into groups, themes, sub-themes, overarching themes, etc., etc. There's a couple more in the paper, and I've just pulled this one out there as well. Fear of social judgment. And this was quite an interesting point that they brought out. I need to be careful about people and a bit worried about what's going to happen to me. Are we all going to get rounded up and taken to a camp somewhere? And this is just interesting in that, their interpretation here, expression of rounded up and taken to a camp, seems to suggest an allusion to the persecution of those sent to the concentration camps during the Holocaust, and this seems totally disproportionate to the reality of his situation. But interesting in the way that people talk about things, and then the way that the researchers interpret them. So when you report these things, you would always in the publications you don't get the full transcripts and that sort of thing, but typically what you do is you give sample of the sorts of questions that you ask. You would always, if you did it for a thesis, you would always submit the full transcript with all the questions and answers in there. And it is possible that you can unintentionally lead participants. So that's on the themes you personally expect to see. And this is critical why you must try and avoid doing that. And you would always submit the full transcript so that it would be possible to see the questions that were asked as to why people gave answers. I've known undergraduate students do that in the past where they've been interested in an area, and what they have done is they've asked questions that have led them to the goal that they wanted to get to, and it's not good. But I have seen it from, not recently, but from undergraduates in the past. So they go through all the theories, all the themes that they pull out, the quotes and that sort of thing, they explain them. And then they have a full discussion of their findings in relation to previous work and theory. When it comes to your assignment, it's all about the analysis of the data rather than the discussion of it in terms of previous work and theory. I want you to be pulling out the themes that you see, and if you can link it to other bits, then that's good. But it's all about the analysis of the data rather than a thorough discussion of the area. But basically, the sorts of things that you find in discussions of these kinds are just relate to previous research and how and how it all fits together, and hopefully is supportive, but also in some cases isn't supportive and might be contradictory. A lot of the stuff that they talk about is supportive in theirs. The conclusion to their study, and I think that in this respect it's valuable. The idea of the self being important in participants' experience of chronic pain sensation, because it is the self, to some extent, that is affected by the chronic pain, and the sensation and the understanding of the self and your place in the world and your relationships with others and your self-regard, self-esteem, and things like that are all really, really important. As I say, it tends not to be the agony of the pain itself that tends to be the major problem, but the way that the pain affects your behaviour and your interactions and relationships with others. You are looking into behaviour. Yeah, well, I take your point, Helen. These things do come out in other behaviours. But yeah, basically, so these are the sorts of conclusions that they come up with. How they feel in the world and their place in the world. And when you think about it, there's a lot to be considered here in terms of the help for people with chronic pain, which is a lot beyond the relief of the pain in itself. My cat's obviously getting fed up of it talking, of me talking. So, Apollo, that's an interesting question. In such cases, is there a way to figure out if a person is more concerned about the pain itself or what the pain is turning them into? This particular study was focusing on the sense of self and how that sense of self affects their lives, relationships, and things like that. And so it wasn't focusing on the pain itself, but it could be something that the study could certainly investigate. It could, that you could try and bring the two together to focus on the pain or the other elements of it. This study was focusing on the self rather than just the pain. And the thing is that one thing that they have shown is that there do appear to be effects on the self and that sort of thing. Okay, it's 6:30. I think that it seems like that is a reasonable point to stop. Can you include qual and quant? Yes, you can include qual and quant in a thesis. That has to take quite a lot of thinking about because there's twice the work. Okay, next Wednesday I'll do one that focuses on. I'll try and get some material together to sort of actually try and demonstrate the analysis procedure on a transcript. Yeah, I'll share the slides and the recording on YouTube, assuming that it's all saved or recorded all right. And if it hasn't, I'll have to do a separate recording. Happy Teachers' Day. Is there a Teachers' Day? I didn't know there was a Teachers' Day, Kathy. Where's that? Tomorrow? Is it? Well, I'll celebrate then. Never knew there was a Teachers' Day. Okay. Right, let me just see where I am. Aha. Save as.